All right, so in this video, I want to talk about options for minor settlements and why, why I believe that structured settlement annuity in a lot of cases, I won't say all cases, but in most cases, does present a pretty compelling option for minors. So, when you're personal injury attorney, you're handling a case. At some point in your career, probably a large portion of cases that you get are going to involve some minor, and they're going to receive some amount of money. And I get this question a lot where, they're just kind of trying to figure out the best option for what to do with the settlement. It could be that the minor themselves, he or she was injured, and they're getting the money, or often it's a wrongful death case, and maybe a parent was killed or something in an accident and they passed away. And so now the minor is receiving a large amount of money. And obviously, you can't just give money outright to a, 2-year-old or even a 17-year-old. It has to go somewhere before they become an adult. And so one of the options I think out there is structured settlement annuities. And so I'm going to spend most of the time in this, 3-minute video or so kind of talking about that. But I'll talk about other options elsewhere. So option number one, and this is probably what a lot of the parents want, is just to give the money directly to them. And I think most of us would agree that it's probably not the best option because they're going to spend the money, even if they're well-intentioned parents. We don't want them using the minor's money, even for basic living expenses like rent and other things like that, or paying for medical bills, even though that would be helpful, again, and I know a lot of these clients come from challenged, just don't have financial resources, but ultimately the money's for the child. And so most jurisdictions even have a maximum threshold, right? Usually a couple $1,000s that they could, yeah, give it to the parent. But if it's above that amount, most courts, most judges, it's even statutory. They won't, that's not even an option. Number two, and I hear this a lot and I see this one a lot, is let's just put it into the court registry or even a what might be called a blocked account or a guardianship account, conservatorship. I'd say most people don't go the guardianship route and put it in that just because I'll address that elsewhere, but doesn't really make sense. But for some of these quote unquote smaller settlements, the argument is, well, let's just put it in the court registry. It's easy. And ultimately, what happens is then when the minor turns 18, they just go to the court registry and they get the money, and that's it. The real two knocks on this one are number one, they get the money outright at 18. So if it's any, if it's a couple $1,000s, okay, maybe that makes sense. And the child's 17 and they want the money at 18. Okay, I could see the argument for that. But if it's, even if it's, 15, $20,000, well, do we really want the 18-year-old getting the money outright at 18? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on their age and other things. But it really, the second big thing is it's really not going to earn any sort of meaningful interest. And again, this is state specific, county specific, how much interest it's earning. But it's typically less than 1%, maybe 2% is as high as I've seen it. But it's generally very low returns. So again, if this is a minor who's 2 years old, do we want the money sitting there basically earning no interest until they turn 18? So again, I'm not saying this is never an option. I just usually not the best option. Or they could use some sort of trust. And this is definitely an option, right? And this could be because they're getting government benefits and they need a special needs trust to protect those benefits. Or we could use what's called, it goes by different names, but typically I call it a settlement protection trust, where the money is typically going to be professionally managed. And this is something that, we do. So we might invest the money. And then there's a trust document that kind of determines when and how the minor gets the money. And so this can definitely be an option. This one, uh, broadly speaking, tends to be a little bit higher settlement just because you've got to pay to set up the trust. There's a trustee fee for administering the trust, and then there's an investment management fee. So again, broadly speaking, if this is, less than 100,000, $200,000, maybe not the best option as well. But definitely something, definitely we use this a fair amount. But the one I'm really talking about today is the structured settlement. Annuity. So there's several advantages to it. Number one is the tax-free growth. I think this is where probably the one of the biggest selling points of the structured settlement annuity is that they don't pay any taxes on it. And so most, PI attorneys know that the settlement itself is not taxed. So, i.e., the principal. So if it settles for 200 grand, client gets 200 grand, they're not going to pay taxes on that 200,000. But if they were to turn around and say invest that 200,000 in the stock market and that 200 grows to 250, well, they're going to pay typically some version of capital gains on that 50,000, that growth of 50,000. Whereas if they're using a structure and let's say that same thing, it grows to 250, they're not going to pay taxes on that 50 grand. So that's one of the major benefits of using structured settlement annuities is the tax free. The other big one is control, right? Because often, and I have this conversation on a weekly basis with a parent who's kind of determining what to do is, if they've got a 2-year-old, they have no clue what their 18-year-old is going to be like. They could be very responsible. They may not be very responsible. If it's a 17-year-old, you kind of know, do you want them getting any sort of money or not, or do you want to delay it until maybe a later date? And so that's, one of the things that we can do with the structure is we can say, well, let's say maybe they get a little bit at 18, a little bit at 20, a little bit at 25, a little bit at 30. Let's say, you want to set it up so they get monthly income for the next 15 years. You want to set up some designated for college. We do this quite a bit where maybe they get two payments each year for that 4-year period of, 18 to 21, where, they get a little bit in January, a little bit in, August or something to pay for tuition. So you get to be really flexible in designing the plan. And I think a lot of parents like this. Now, it can be stressful because you don't know what your 18-year-old is going to be like or adult. But again, depending on the amount, if it's, $1 million they're getting, well, I think most parents would agree, hey, we don't want the child to get $1 million at 18. We maybe want to set them up, so that they've got, this can be used over their lifetime or at set intervals. Or if it's a smaller amount, same thing. Maybe we want to make sure that they get some of it to, as a down payment on a house. And so this kind of control and timing of when and how they get the money, I think is probably one of the most attractive things to parents, even more so than the tax-free thing, because a lot of people aren't thinking about that piece of it. So I think this is probably one of the most beneficial things. I talked about the returns. The returns are going to vary, right? It really depends on what type of environment we're in. Interest rates, they can be upwards of 6% or 2%, right? So I'd say most of the time they're probably in that 4 to 5 range is typical. But again, depending on when you're watching this, that really can change. The one thing I always like to tell people though is you know, take that percentage and, maybe add a 0.5% or a full percent to it because you're not paying taxes on it. So in our, investment practice where maybe we could shoot for a 8% return, and the structure is only paying a 4% return. Well, if you add in that you've got to pay capital gains on that 8% and you don't have to pay taxes on the 4%, maybe that 8 comes down to 7 and that 4 goes up to 5, very, very broadly speaking, and we run an analysis on it. But that's just something to consider as well, because sometimes that interest rate might look a little bit lower than if you were to invest in the stock market, which is almost always going to be the case anyways. Again, but the benefit of this is it's set, so you know what the amount is going to be. So again, it's going to be, but regardless, it's I think always going to be higher than just putting in the court registry. Um, and again, to that kind of last point is, it's a set amount. So if the structure, when we set it up, that it's saying that, hey, that 50,000, you put it in a structure, we're guaranteed 75,000, for example, that amount is not going to change. So if it was guaranteed at $75,000 when you set it up, that is what it's going to be. The payments are going to be what the payments, say they're going to be at the very beginning. So that kind of adds a lot of um, relief, I think, to a lot of parents. Because again, if you invest in the stocks at all, you know those go up and down. And for a minor who maybe is going to have large medical bills or anything like that, they may need that income, right? They can't afford it to fluctuate like it can in the stock market. So again, that's one of the major benefits. So again, one last point on this is, a lot of these clients I know are or will be receiving government benefits, maybe SSI or Medicaid. And one of the things we always do in our analysis is let's make sure we don't jeopardize those benefits. And that's what can happen if you give a client, the money outright. So one of the options is we can actually use a structure, settlement annuity, have the funds pay into the structure, and then the structure pays into the special needs trust. And there's a lot of benefits to that. So you still get to keep the client doesn't jeopardize his or her government benefits, and you get still all the benefits of a structure. So that's a really great option. So again, I think in a lot of cases, using a structure or some combination of a structure does make sense. I think one of the things I get asked a lot is, what's the minimum? In most cases, it's $10,000, and that's really life insurance companies who are issuing the structure, that's typically their minimum. So anything $10,000 and below, probably not an option, but 10,000 and above, I think we at least having the conversation with the parent, looking at different options. Because again, I think in most instances, it can make sense. So yeah, hope you find that helpful. Again, if you've got a case, might be worth considering the structure for it.